I want to welcome everybody to our grand rounds. And this is a little bit different from our usual grand round, so I'm very excited about today's talk. Just as a reminder, because of the different focus of the talk, there is not going to be any CME credit for this morning, so you don't have to worry about registering or signing in. So you can just sit back and relax and enjoy the journey. And so introducing today's special Grand Round speaker is our own Dr. Michael Lucey. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lucey.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you for inviting Catherine to be our Grand Round speaker, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce her. And I'll just for a few moments give you a little bit about her background. Like her parents, she was born in Dublin, and she spent her early years in London. And when we came to the United States to Ann Arbor, Michigan, she was 6, and she spent the next 10 years in Michigan. And then we moved to Philly. She discovered her passion for journalism when she was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania. And after graduating, she joined the Associated Press, and after that, the Philadelphia Daily News as a reporter, and spent several years there. And then early in the cycle for the 2016 presidential election, she rejoined the Associated Press and moved with her family to Des Moines, Iowa, to cover presidential politics, including the Iowa caucuses in that sequence. After the culmination of the 2016 election, she moved with the AP as a White House reporter coming to DC, where she now is. Now, this has all been something of a surprise to us because Catherine comes from a family of intense introverts, where dinner at the dinner table is composed of long periods of silence, punctuated by the occasional gesture or murmur. But she has overcome that handicap in her family and has become now the White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and we're very proud of her. And I'm very pleased to introduce her now as she gives her talk, which she has entitled "From Trump to Biden, an Insider's View of Reporting on the White House." So thank you very much, Catherine.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, particularly Dr. Schnapp. Thank you, Clint Thayer, for helping me with tech support. And I guess I'll also thank my dad. I understand that a lot of your guests often bring more of a visual display, but I hope you'll enjoy my remarks, and I'm happy to take any questions you have at the end. I am sorry you cannot get any continuing medical education credit for it. So if I go back, I knew early on that there was something different about Donald Trump as a political candidate. I first encountered him in Iowa in the summer of 2015. I was a politics reporter for the Associated Press based in Des Moines. As my dad said, I moved out there to cover the caucuses. He came to Iowa that summer for the state fair. Now, the state fair is a very big deal in Iowa. I'm sure it is as well in Wisconsin, and it's a prime destination for political candidates. I'd already at that point spent weeks there watching them speak on what's called the soapbox, watching them sample food like pork chops on a stick, deep fried Oreos. They also always made a pilgrimage to visit the famous butter cow. And they tried to talk to locals about their candidacies. But Trump did it his own way. He came with his helicopter, took it to a nearby field, and proceeded to give rides to local children. He then addressed a crowd of reporters in the field before he decided to make his way to the fairgrounds. Now, when he did, he was mobbed. I have pictures of that day. He was he was crowded by reporters, by people. The sort of narrow streets of the fairground were overflowing with people trying to see him as he walked down the pathway. He was doing interviews with CNN as they were coming into the group. He was, talking to people on the side, but it was increasingly very hard for anyone to move through this massive crowd. And locals told me they'd never seen crowds like that before at the state fair, even for, and they'd seen Barack Obama, they'd seen any number of hugely popular political candidates. But this was different. The scale of this was different. Eventually, the numbers got so big that Trump was put in a golf cart to be driven off site. There were a number of golf carts, being driven around, mostly to take senior citizens, who needed to be escorted places on the fairgrounds. But at that point, another reporter and I jumped into a golf cart, and I said, for the first and last time in my life, follow that golf cart. And thus, the world's slowest chase scene ensued. Sadly, we didn't catch him, though at one point he did tell me it was a day of love. So it's interesting to look back at this now, but really it was a window into the enthusiasm and the passion that Donald Trump inspired. And that hasn't changed. We've seen that throughout his presidency. I'm sorry, I lost my place there for a moment. Yes, so we've seen that throughout his presidency. We've seen his passion. We've seen the support that he has won from his fans. And this, of course, was only the beginning. Over the years, I covered his rise to the presidency, his norm-smashing, chaotic 4 years in office. And of course, that concluded just a few weeks ago with a pro-Trump riot at the US Capitol. We're now a few weeks into the new administration. President Joe Biden is working overtime to undo much of Trump's legacy. But we're in a complicated moment as a nation. The country is deeply divided. We remain in the throes of a deadly pandemic. There are divisions within both political parties. On the GOP side, Trump continues to enjoy strong support from most of his party, as we've seen in recent weeks. And we'll see that again this weekend as he addresses a conservative political group. So here we are. This is 2021, and we're just getting started. Before we talk more about where we are and where we go next, I was going to try and step back, reflect a little bit on how I got here to this particular front row seat to history. If we go back to the very beginning, I am told by my father that I never stopped asking questions when I was a little kid. I stumbled into journalism, working for the college newspaper, and found that was covering both journalism and covering politics was a passion as I covered a mayoral election in Philadelphia. I then parlayed that into a job at a tabloid newspaper in Philadelphia, where I covered late night shootings, homicides, eventually city politics. I also spent a season documenting the ways of Philadelphia Eagles fans, which in retrospect was a pretty good way to prepare for dealing with the unique passion and intensity that you find at a Trump rally. So in Philadelphia, I wrote about everything from the underfunded city pension system to an abuse scandal at the Public Housing Authority. During the 2008 downturn, I saw how policies impact people as the city pursued massive budget cuts. I also saw some of the first events with then Senator Barack Obama as he started his presidential bid. And what I learned then is what I know now, that as journalists, we do our best to ask the smart questions, hold institutions accountable, bring our readers the stories that matter. And in Philly, we weren't afraid to punch above our weight or have fun with the news at times. When there was a transit strike in Philadelphia, the Daily News organized a race with 4 staffers. We went to a far-flung part of the city and had to get downtown via bike, hitchhike, taxi, on foot. I was on foot. I brought my boyfriend's dog. The newsroom cheered when I arrived. Naturally, I was last after 3 hours. But I will say that the photos of me and the dog walking through the park remain some of the most popular of my career. So along the way, I got married and had a baby. And in 2012, I decided I wanted to cover national politics. And that's when I made, I think, the obvious choice. I moved to Iowa. Okay, to be honest, to a lot of East Coasters, this was not an obvious choice. But I was offered a job to cover state and national politics for the Associated Press in Des Moines. And I knew that in 2016, the presidential race will be wide open for both parties. It was a way in the door. And so with my family, we packed up and we headed to the Midwest. It ended up being one of the smartest things I ever did professionally. I spent 2 years covering mostly state politics. That included the state government, but also Senator Joni Ernst's successful Senate bid. I also had another baby. And by 2015, the caucus chaos, you might say, was well underway. So a lot of ink is spilled on Iowa's first in the nation status. That's especially true after the 2020 caucuses. And I'm not really here to assess whether it should or should not continue. That debate is going to rage for a while. But I'll tell you that documenting that process in 2015 and 2016 was an amazing, intimate look at how we pick presidents. In 2015, I covered at least 15 Republicans, all 3 Democrats vying for president. And what's amazing about Iowa is that you really see them up close and personal. So throughout that year, I put thousands of miles on my car, driving to see them in all the corners of the state, all of them trying to pull off that elusive Iowa surprise. I saw Bernie Sanders address standing room crowds in Clear Lake. I saw Rick Perry working pizza ranches, Carly Fiorina in small town libraries, Jeb Bush wandering through the Iowa Capitol. Hillary Clinton at one point was at my local coffee shop. Chris Christie was a huge hit at the state fair, and Bobby Jindal picked up my daughter at a 4th of July parade. And because I was an Iowa-based reporter, they all wanted to talk to me, or at least most of them did. And the thing that is special about Iowa is that you can see how people connect with the voters. I watched as Bernie Sanders outgrew coffee houses and halls, and he moved his rallies to state fairgrounds as he talked about universal healthcare and free college. I saw Hillary Clinton struggle to get the same kinds of crowds and enthusiasm. I saw Jeb Bush struggle to take off. And Marco Rubio got younger people out, which is interesting at his events, but they were few and far between. Ted Cruz, for a time, was really the rock star of the Christian right in Iowa. There was also the life of the B-listers, because there's such a big field of candidates. I saw Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum play to dwindling crowds. That included a night when Huckabee appeared during the dinner hour at a senior home. Some people left after dessert, even though he was still speaking. But the state fair that summer was perhaps the most intense distillation of the process. I spent nearly 2 weeks there on the fairgrounds as every candidate took their turn, taking questions from a stage trimmed with hay bales, known as the soapbox. And you saw Jeb Bush was swarmed by press. He had a huge media mob around him when he came to the state fair. Hillary Clinton tried to sample fair food without an awkward photo opportunity. Christie was protested by animal rights activists. But as I said before, in what would become a pattern throughout the following year, everything paled in comparison with Trump's mob scene. It is, of course, interesting to remember now that Trump didn't win the 2016 Iowa caucuses. Ted Cruz, propelled by Christian conservatives, won the honor. But Trump quickly bulldozed past the rest of the field. And I spent much of the rest of the year on the Clinton campaign plane, following her campaign as she competed first with Bernie Sanders and then with Donald Trump. You'll recall the plane didn't spend a lot of time in Wisconsin. The day after Trump surprised many of us with his win, my bosses at the Associated Press asked me if I wanted to come to Washington to cover him. And I said yes. So on the first day of Donald Trump's presidency, Sean Spicer came to the White House press briefing room to complain about the size of the inauguration crowd. On the second day, Trump went to the CIA and railed against what he called the dishonest media. I was new to the White House, but it was clear immediately that this was a very different type of administration. So, as we all know, Trump's administration unfolded over the last 4 years, sometimes in a blur. The Russia investigation, Charlottesville, family separation, Stormy Daniels, Ukraine, impeachment. There was a revolving door of press secretaries and chiefs of staff. Even though he wouldn't run for re-election for years, from the very beginning, he kept holding his signature rallies. White House reporters had to acclimate to his use of Twitter. He announced major policies, started conflicts, conducted diplomacy, all by tweet. We worked earlier, we worked later, we were always on our phones. Now, covering the White House, you tend to wear a lot of hats. On any given day, I might be at the press briefing or traveling with the president, trying to unravel a policy proposal, chasing down a tip. Sometimes you're part of the protective press pool that always travels with the president to document his movements. That can mean flying on Air Force One, or with Trump, it often meant sitting in a van outside a golf course on a weekend. A big part of covering any president is understanding how he or she thinks. This was even more important with Trump because no one else could reliably speak for him and his intentions. So you had to really understand how he was processing information. And one early lesson I learned with Trump was, and this is how people around him would describe it, was he was always trying to win. Not just the election or the issue or the news cycle, literally the moment, the minute. I found my tabloid training actually very valuable covering his White House. I was comfortable shouting a question at him in the Oval Office, trying to push him for more information on the plane. And while Trump railed against the press, he also relished talking to reporters. At the White House, he regularly spoke at length in the Oval to the press pool, and he talked so frequently as he exited the White House from Marine One when he would be traveling, that those sessions were called chopper talk. Now, if you look back at Trump's campaign promises and his policies, he certainly never did some of the things he promised to do. He never repealed and replaced the Affordable Care Act, for example. But he does have a policy legacy that lives on. Perhaps the most notable thing is judges. He installed 3 Supreme Court judges, as well as numerous federal judges, which will leave a lasting impact on the federal bench. He passed a massive tax cut, and he shifted some of the way the nation applies diplomacy to countries like China. He also really united the Republican Party around his version of conservatism. And that appears unlikely to change anytime soon. Working for the AP and later now for the Wall Street Journal, I was there for any number of key moments during Trump's presidency. It was the day he threatened North Korea with fire and fury, or his summit with Kim Jong-un. The day Kanye West came to visit him in the Oval Office, or the day he met with survivors of the Parkland shooting. Perhaps my best moment covering Trump came in the spring of 2018 when I was assigned to cover him on a trip to West Virginia. It was a quick day, just a short trip there and back, traveling in the smaller of the 2 planes that typically serve as Air Force One. Now, one aspect of covering the president on the road is being prepared if he talks to the press. And you don't exactly know if or when that will be. Sometimes he speaks on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base. Sometimes he comes back and talks to reporters on the plane. With Trump, it was always hard to predict, although, as I said before, he was fond of talking to the press and frequently held forth both on the road and at the White House. But at this particular moment, the president had not taken questions in some time, and one question that was getting louder and louder at that moment was the nature of his alleged relationship with the adult film actress known as Stormy Daniels, who claimed that she had been paid off by the president's attorney to keep quiet about an encounter. So on that particular day, the flight to West Virginia for an event was uneventful. On the way back, though, Trump did come back to talk to reporters in the back of the plane, and he even let TV cameras roll as he took some questions. And after a few minutes, I asked, Mr. President, did you know about the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels? Trump said no. I pushed again. I asked why his attorney, Michael Cohen, would have done it. He said, you'll have to ask Michael. Later in the year, Cohen pleaded guilty to a series of federal crimes and said he had coordinated with Trump on the payments. In the fall, I did an interview with Trump. I asked him again about Daniels, specifically about how he had referred to her as, quote, a horse face. I asked him how people should view that kind of statement about a woman. You can take it any way you want, he said. Now, about a year ago, had you asked me about Trump's prospects for re-election, I would have said that he had a very clear path forward. He had survived impeachment. The economy was booming. He was sitting on a small fortune of campaign cash, and the Democrats were still had not landed on a candidate to try and compete against him. But that was before we really understood COVID. So one day I sometimes think about is the day that Trump had beat impeachment and he invited a slew of friends and allies to the White House, and he waved the papers, the newspapers, showing that he had been acquitted over his head. He railed against the media and his political enemies. It was one of his perhaps last truly great days in office. A few weeks later, he went to India. He addressed a crowd of 100,000 people. But by the time he was on his way back to the US, the warning signs were clear. Trump tried to downplay COVID, but he couldn't. His administration's response was marked with inconsistencies and infighting. He took to the briefing room to yell at reporters. He refused to endorse mask wearing at times. He picked fights with governors. He resumed holding campaign rallies despite the warnings. For us, the pandemic made it harder to do some of the work we typically do, particularly in a campaign year. It made covering the White House more challenging because we had to go in there, we had to be masked, we were trying to limit the number of reporters that would be in there at any given time. It also meant that for the campaign, we spent less time on the road talking to voters, trying to understand how they feel. And that was a loss because there's really no replacement for on-the-ground reporting to capture the mood of the country in a moment. The fall demonstrated the kinds of highs and lows we repeatedly saw with Trump. He saw the successful confirmation of a third Supreme Court justice. He then held an event to celebrate her confirmation that was later labeled a coronavirus super spreader. He caught COVID himself, but recovered enough in time to hold a final blitz of campaign rallies. But in the end, the virus robbed Trump of the booming economy that he saw as his ticket to re-election. And it raised questions about his leadership with key groups of voters. That the election had the highest turnout in over 100 years. And Trump did win 74 million votes, exceeding polling and expectations, and proving that his support and his message may well live on. Since the election, obviously, he spent months disputing the results, despite a lack of evidence of any kind of widespread voter fraud. And on January 6th, a pro-Trump mob stormed the Capitol looking to overturn those results. The chaos and violence of that day will live on in infamy. And Republicans are still grappling with their path forward. I'm going to detour for a second and note that a question I get asked a lot is how I do this kind of work with small children. And often I'm not entirely sure of the answer myself. To quote Hillary Clinton, it takes a village. To quote Rick Santorum, it takes a family. I think in my case, I'd argue both are right. My kids have a devoted family who pitch in massively during non-COVID times, as well as a massive rotating cast of babysitters, neighbors, teachers, friends. But I am frequently the only working mom in the room or on the road, which can lead to any number of odd moments. In 2014, for example, former President Bill Clinton's security detail guarded a restroom for me while I pumped. In 2016, when I started flying around the country, I would sometimes call home from a rally around bedtime and try and sing my kids a lullaby, which meant that at one point a security guard in Flint walked around a corner to find me doing my best version of Part of Your World from The Little Mermaid. Later that year, the entire Clinton press pool sang Happy Birthday to my son from the back of the plane. After we moved to Washington, my son had a tough day at his new school one day, and his teacher called me at work. I didn't like to tell the teacher that I was on Air Force One about to take off, so I just tried to calm him down before I lost my cell signal. Later on that year, I brought my son to the White House for Take Your Kids to Work Day. I can report that he hated it. But in general, my kids are good sports, if entirely underwhelmed. Another frequent question is about the treatment of press and how that's changed or what that has been like covering Trump. And of course, I mean, at times that can indirectly affect my family as well. And yes, I've received threats. I've received harassing phone calls, emails, texts. I've been yelled at rallies and Trump events. I've been called names I certainly can't say at this hour of the morning. Coming up covering crime and city politics, I wasn't unfamiliar with threats or difficult phone calls, but the intensity of the vitriol and the ease of access afforded by social media is undoubtedly different in this moment. And I know that's true for a lot of my colleagues as well. I will say, though, I never considered leaving the story. It's also not about me. We're trying to write the story, write it straight, and write it every day, whether it is about Trump or about Biden, and we take the criticism as best we can, however it comes. So, as I speak to you today, we are weeks into President Joe Biden's administration. He has spent his time so far, a lot of it, trying to roll back Trump's policies when he can, in the ways that he can. And he's pushing for the passage of a massive COVID-19 aid bill. He has promised a return to norms. His White House has resumed some things like regular press briefings, which had for a long time not been the practice under Trump. We've also seen some other domestic rhythms change at the White House. You know, Biden, for example, is a regular mass goer, so the press pack follows him most weekends to Holy Trinity Catholic Church in Georgetown on Saturdays or Sundays. He also has dogs at the White House, which has been the first thing in a long time. But given the strict COVID protocols, he's limited in how he does his job. This week, for example, he met the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau virtually rather than in person at the White House. There are questions I can't answer today about how he will oversee this historically massive vaccine campaign, how he'll manage the extremes of his own party, and how he'll try to work across the aisle. His party's fortunes in the midterm elections will likely depend on if Biden can get the public vaccinated and get the economy going again and give people some more confidence that things are heading in the right direction. So I think the thing I can say for now is that we will be covering him just as intently, just as seriously, asking the tough questions, holding the institutions accountable, and giving our readers the most important stories. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you for a fascinating look. I am sure there are many stories to tell. Maybe you're saving it for the upcoming book, perhaps. So we've got a couple of questions already. So Calvin Bruce is the first. Clint, can you open it up? Is Calvin going to answer the question?
I see it. Do you want me to read it? Or?
Sure.
Great. Hi, Calvin. Calvin asks, were you at the famous bleach and UV light press conference? And if so, do you think his advisors were truly aghast, as the media has suggested? I actually was at that press conference when Trump mused about whether you could inject bleach as a treatment. And I can certainly say that that remark was not planned. No one who worked for him had advised him to say that. And people were definitely surprised by those remarks. And in a lot of ways, that press conference, if you recall, in the early days of the COVID response with the Trump administration, initially the vice president, Mike Pence, had been doing those briefings, with the health officials trying to talk about the response. And at some point, Trump himself decided to take them over, and then he started doing them every day. And you might remember they were, they were often 2 hours long. He was going back and forth with reporters. They got heated at times. And there were, even before the bleach press conference, I think there were advisors who questioned whether this was a good idea. But that press conference was seen as one of the reasons that he stopped doing them for a period, that spring and summer.
Couple of questions from Farah. Do you go to the White House every day when the president's there? Do you have to write a story every day? Do you spend the whole day at the White House? And what do you do after this? Where do you go?
So many details. I do not go to the White House every day. I am on a team of, I think my father suggested I was the White House reporter. I am on a team of White House reporters. And so my colleagues and I divide up the work of who's going to be there any given day for a briefing or for an event. And in addition, there are extra restrictions at the moment because of the pandemic, where the journalists that cover the White House are trying to limit how many of us are in the building at any given time. So I was there once this week. I'm there periodically, but I'm not there every day. I write stories lots of days. I do not write stories every day. It depends. Also, some days I am writing a story on something the president said or did that day. Some days sometimes I'm taking a couple days to write something that's like a longer, deeper look at an issue or policy. So it's not every day. Where do I go after this? Sometimes I spend the whole day there. That really, again, sort of depends on what the president is doing. If there's a bunch of stuff he's doing that we can see, there's a workspace for reporters there. So sometimes I spend the whole day there. I don't really know what I'll go and do after this. I kind of take it as it comes.
Okay. From Mihaela, how do you handle the insults and slurs that seems to be slung at women reporters in particular, in the prior administration and in general? How has it been being a woman in the press corps?
It certainly does sometimes feel like there's particular vitriol aimed at women. As I said before, I've gotten sort of intimidating emails or messages on Twitter or texts. I try. I mean, if things feel truly threatening, obviously I tell my employers. We have sort of a whole system for that. I also, I try pretty hard to be careful about, keeping my social media is very focused on the work. And just, I think that's kind of what I always go back to, is it's about the work. That's what I tweet about. That's what I talk about. And I try and not make it personal.
So, question from Joe Bluestein is whether you want to disclose who you voted for in prior elections.
No, thank you for asking, Joe, but no, I do not want to disclose who I voted for.
Yeah, so it brings up another question of how do you balance your own views and beliefs while you're covering both parties, and do your own personal biases influence your reporting?
I think I've been doing this for a long time at this point, covering politics and government at the city level, at the state level, and now at the national level. And we work really hard to make sure that we are looking at things in a clear-eyed way, talking to people on both sides of the aisle, casting a wide net when we do our reporting to make sure we have a broad perspective, and not like leaning on personal opinion, because that's not our role. My role is to try and bring the most sort of nuanced and thoughtful presentation of things to the readers. And I think having worked in a number of different places also helps with that, because I have perspective on how people in urban areas think about it, how people in middle America think. And I think that also helps. I think one of the things we've really learned in the last few years with Trump is just how big this country is and how big a range of opinions and feelings and views there are. And it's really important for us to try and wrestle with what that means and why people think the way they think. So my job is to try and interpret it, not to try and tell you my opinions.
One thing that was striking to me for the Trump administration was the lack of belief in science and following facts. So I'm curious of your view of trying to cover Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we saw throughout 2020, I think a reoccurring theme was that Trump would repeatedly sort of disavow his science advisors, and we saw that again and again, that they would try to put out certain information. He would question it. He was questioning the judgment, and he was often just not taking the advice. So continuing to hold rallies, hold large events, and coming to states like Wisconsin and defying sort of local rules and recommendations about the number of people that should be at a gathering. He continued with all of that. And in terms of the coverage, I think what we try to do is really make sure that we are being very, very clear about what the experts are actually saying. So here's what the CDC is saying. Here's what Tony Fauci is saying. Here's what we know from talking to doctors and professors and experts. We have the great thing about the Journal is we have a really deep bench of policy experts, and so we have a lot of people who I cover the politics and the White House and some of the policy, but we have people who are true healthcare experts who really, and I think one of the things we also saw with COVID was, especially people are home, people are worried, and people are trying to get information. There was a real need. People really wanted sort of question and answer type stories that explained what was going on, what's the latest information, what do we know, what's the current guidance, and so I think we worked really hard to make sure that we were reflecting that in our stories.
And then since Trump is now banned from Twitter, how do you think that's going to affect his future political career? Do you have any thoughts of what Facebook is going to be doing?
That is, a fascinating turn, because we just don't hear as much from him at all. I mean, as I said, after 4 years where I woke up to Trump tweets and went to bed to Trump tweets, it is a real shift to not be hearing from him in the same way. So it's certainly not ideal for him. It was his preferred method of communication. He had a massive audience there. He liked that he was able to tweet things and he'd see them scrolling on the news channels. He really used that to drive the conversation or change the conversation a lot of days. And so that limits him not having access to that. Though that said, that does not mean that he is not trying to keep his political options open. He's speaking at the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is in Florida this weekend. That'll be his first kind of big public event. I think there are exploring ways if there are other platforms for him to use. I don't know what will happen with Facebook, but I think it is a real shift for him, and it's not entirely clear yet how he can, how he can replace it.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It's kind of a loss. There's a big hole not hearing all of the Twitterisms.
Absolutely. I mean, you saw a couple of times recently. He's called into TV shows to react to things, and that's partly, or they have to issue statements. They've been issuing press releases. He has called into some Fox TV shows, but he does not have the ability to do that kind of immediate reaction on Twitter the way he used to.
Yeah. Question from Kristen King. Where were you on January 6th, and what was your experience on that day?
I will say I was not at the Capitol on January 6th. I was working from home that day. Right. And I wrote a story with colleagues where we tried to talk to as many people as we could who were in the building to kind of give an inside sense of what happened. So I was in touch with colleagues who were covering the rally with Trump, and then obviously with people who were, so I had some colleagues who were at the rally and did cover the march to the White House and saw what that looked like. And so I was in touch with those people. I was not on the ground, but it was, I mean, for all of us, a pretty overwhelming thing to watch.
Yeah. Trying to keep up with all the questions.
No, I should look as well.
So from Dod Siraj, Dod is an immigrant from Ethiopia, now in the middle of a catastrophic civil war, who really appreciates independent reporters and appreciative of the work that you do and your colleagues do. So how do you pick a story to do? Is that, there's so many breaking news every day. Is that your decision? Is it come from the Wall Street Journal?
Sure. Also, well, thanks for the question. And I was in Ethiopia 2 years ago, and it was a really amazing country. So it's a mix. A lot, covering the kind of beat I cover, a lot of it is dictated by the rhythms of the president and the White House. So right now, for example, a big story that I'm covering is, how they get the COVID-19 bill passed. And so we're talking to people at the White House, we're talking to people on the Hill, we're talking to lawmakers. So we're tracking that really closely. So some of it is the day-to-day stories of the White House. When he first came in, a big story was the number of executive orders he was doing. So some of it is that. So one big piece of it always is kind of like the news of the day and what the White House is doing. But then other stories I do where you're trying to pull back the lens a bit and explain, why they're doing what they're doing. So, or try and dig deeper. So I did a story recently about the promise to open, majority of K-8 schools in the first 100 days, and the challenges of doing it and the political consequences of that promise. And so that's a little bit more trying to explain and sort of show some more context for a moment. Or I did another story with a colleague talking about the efforts to frame the COVID bill as a bipartisan bill based on the idea that it's got bipartisan support in the country, even though they're having difficulty getting any Republican senators to sign on. So that's an example of a story where we look at what the White House is doing and then try and sort of provide our own analysis. And then other things we do are sort of, digging into issues, trying to, a big story I did, for example, early in the Trump administration was I spent a lot of time with a colleague who does data analysis, and we tracked his judicial appointments in the first year and looked at them by race and gender. And I did a database, and by looking at that, we were able to establish that it was one of the least diverse groups. You'd had to go back, I think, to George H.W. Bush to get an equally sort of. So we looked there at. So that was us. I sort of noticed as I just saw press releases about it that it seems like there's a lot of men in this group. Who are they? And then we were able to do a story about the diversity there. So it's a mix of things. Some of it is the news. Some of it is what we observe. Some of it is sometimes you get a tip from someone saying the administration is using X, Y, or Z, and you should try and check it out. So the stories come, and sometimes they're assigned by editors as well, who say they spot a trend or they are interested in something and they want something.
Does your dad ever say you should cover this?
I never listen to him.
Good advice. Question from Christy Seibert. If you got a chance to give Biden, a word of wisdom, word of advice, what would you say? Or maybe you have given him a word of advice.
I haven't given any advice, but I'm not in the advice business. So I would very much like to speak to him or interview him or talk to him. One of the stories that I did early on about Biden, which I think my dad did like, was about his ties to Ireland. And so, Biden, JFK is, considered the president with the strongest Irish ties, but Biden is even more vocal about his Irish connections and his love of Ireland. And I talked to sort of third cousins he has in the country, and just how excited Ireland was when he was elected, and they're looking forward to a visit there. So that was a fun story to do.
A good question about Trump and his relationship to the news industry and the conflict in the news industry between publicizing Trump and exploiting his celebrity to sell stories versus what is the role of media in promoting some of the issues that Trump has brought out, the not truths at times, and that balancing
No, I
act.
understand. I mean, we just went through several months where he repeatedly insisted that the election had been stolen from him and kept insisting that there had been election fraud when there was, again, no evidence of widespread election fraud. And how do you cover those things? I think how we cover them is he was the president, and so we have a responsibility to cover the president and talk about what he's saying and then apply context to what he's saying. So if you read our stories, and any of our stories would say, Trump complained about this and claimed there was fraud. We will then say there's no evidence of fraud. This many lawsuits have been thrown out. His own aide, his own attorney general. Like we try and cite examples to provide context for the accuracy. And I think what we always try and do is show the reader, why we're explaining it that way.
Great. So I'm going to combine two questions from Kathleen Shannon and Christy Bartles, talking about the current jadedness in many young Americans towards politics. How do you combat that? How do you inspire people to go into politics and public service and in government? And how do you balance that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's a mix with young people. I mean, I don't know if they're all. I don't claim to know, because the young people who live at my house are so young that they're obviously not jaded. But I actually think that we've seen lots of inspiring things from young, activists in recent years. I think the Democratic Party has, moved on a lot of issues because of activism. Some of it from youth activists. We certainly saw after Parkland, those students become really politically active in interesting ways. So, I mean, I do think I do think there are examples of young people being engaged and active. And I think that I would hope that through, their education and conversation and youthful enthusiasm, they would want to continue to get involved.
Right. What was your insight into the relationship between Trump and Pence?
Oh, interesting. I spent a lot of time on the relationship between Trump and Pence. Mike Pence is a very loyal vice president, I think, is the biggest thing you had to understand with Trump and Pence. Going back to when he was, and Trump selected him, I covered a lot of Pence events and travel with Pence, and every Pence speech always opened, with, I come bearing greetings from Donald Trump. I just spoke with him. And Pence was incredibly consistent publicly in praising Trump's agenda, being, very, on the policies, on the politics. He did a huge amount of legwork during 2020, campaigning across the country in a lot of smaller markets, a lot of Midwestern states, with a lot of groups that, Pence connects with well, like Christian conservatives. So he was a very loyal and publicly very, very consistent and very close with Trump. And they had, as I understand, they were in touch. They regularly spoke. They regularly met. Obviously, at the end of his presidency, Donald Trump put Pence in a terrible position. And a lot of people around Pence were really upset by this because they felt legally he could not possibly do what the president wanted him to do in terms of the certifying the results. And ultimately, as you saw, Pence did what he saw as his constitutional duty, and of course was in grave danger that day. I mean, I think we saw in the impeachment trial was just how grave the danger was to him. All that, and we know from our reporting, that Trump did not reach out to Pence that day. Trump tweeted, criticizing Pence that day as the violence started to unfold. All that said, Pence has not publicly criticized Trump, and we don't have any expectation that there's going to be some kind of public rift. So I think the public-facing support is, for the time being, appears likely to continue.
Um, Having been in Iowa, what's your perspective on the pros and cons of keeping the Iowa caucus first versus eliminating that status?
This is the big question. Iowans, if there are any Iowans watching, Iowans obviously are very concerned about this. They take First in the Nation status very seriously, and they very much want to keep it. And their arguments are that it's a smaller state. It provides candidates with the opportunity to do these intimate events. It's a place where it's a more affordable media market for you to test out your messaging. And there's this tradition there. Obviously, the criticism of the process, which has gotten louder in recent years with a lot of Democrats, is that Iowa and New Hampshire are not states that are demographically representative of America, and there should be more diverse populations, getting this early access. And then also, obviously, the Iowa caucuses in 2020 were a debacle. So I don't have an answer for what they're going to do, but there are serious efforts by other states to move up their caucuses. There's conversations about, do you do a bunch of states first? Do you mix it up? I don't know that anything is on the table. It's pretty early. President Biden is avoiding weighing in on this. His White House is for now, but it'll be interesting to see if there's any change to this.
And throughout your career, when you're looking back, is there a question that you wish you had asked at the time that you regret?
It's a great question, and I can't off the top of my head. I don't have a good example of what I wish. When I was covering Pence on a foreign trip once, and he had a meeting with Boris Johnson, and they did a thing where they brought the reporters in briefly. And Johnson talked about chlorinated chicken. And I wish I had asked something of Boris Johnson, but I'm not sure what.
Did Trump ever share his feelings about Bob Woodward's book with any of the White House reporters?
I can't speak for all the White House reporters, so I don't know. I mean, Trump has been pretty vocally complained about any number of, reports and books and reporters. I can't say off the top of my head if he did, but he also gave Bob Woodward a huge amount of access, obviously, for his book.
Okay. And I'm just trying to, there's been so many questions trying to keep track. And so you had tabloid training, and how do you think Trump's background in celebrity culture and his reality TV influences campaign and interactions with the media compared to other politicians? And do you think it's going to continue in that vein, or do you see it going kind of transitioning back to the more traditional?
Yeah, I mean, what we saw with Trump was someone who was media savvy and was very comfortable with the media, was used to the media, and was very good at, you saw in 2015 and 2016, he was very good at getting coverage. He was able to get on the TV shows. He would call in. He would get, huge amounts of time and airtime on television. He also, as president, I think really, he was constantly thinking about the TV moment, so when he went to Singapore to meet Kim Jong-un, he really believed in the power of those images. He thought that the image of him meeting him shaking hands really mattered. He always was concerned about how he looked, how he was presented, was he, what the photos looked like. So he was sort of media conscious about himself and how he presented himself. He also definitely knew how to drive a story. I mean, we saw this again and again as well, that with his Twitter feed or with his sort of spontaneous announcements in the Oval, he was very good at trying to redirect the media or sort of bring up a new topic or a new storyline. You saw that a lot. So I don't think other politicians are all like Trump in that way, but I mean, it sort of remains to be seen. He was a uniquely sort of tabloid creature, but the media age keeps changing as well. We follow stories more rapidly than we ever did before, or, we react to things more rapidly. And so that also, I think, changes the way that we approach public figures.
Do you think this is this your dream job, or is there another job that you aspire to?
My dream job was always to own a bookstore, so I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay.
No, this is I sometimes can't believe I get to do this job. It's fascinating every single day. It's never the same every day. You get to see all these things up close. And really, I mean, if you pull it out, it matters. It matters, you know, how the president works and how the White House works affects real people. And I think that's what you have to come back to is, and what I like is that you feel like what you're writing about does affect people and people care about it and it's important for democracy.
Is there advice you would give a woman in particular in pursuing a job in journalism? Lessons learned?
I think the advice I give to everyone is one, just to work as hard as you can and get as much experience as you can doing different kinds of jobs. I think I'm better served having covered fires and covered, you know, police shootings and covering caucuses and covering state fairs, having a sort of broad range of experience and talking to different kinds of people and, you know, covering protests and covering parades and just all kinds, and covering Eagles fans. Like, I think all that stuff makes you a better journalist. So I think the advice I give anyone is just to try and get jobs where you can do lots of things and that you can stretch and have lots of experiences as a journalist.
Yeah. And then do you feel journalism or reporters are becoming more polarized as well?
You know, I'm not a media reporter, so I don't know that I have a real way in on that. I think we, at the Wall Street Journal, we try really hard to make sure that our reporting and our news section is straight down the middle, that it's, you know, for people across the political spectrum can read our news stories and know that they are impartial, that they're thoughtful, and that they're fair. And that's what we strive for, at least every single day.
Okay. Let me see, scrolling through. I am going to leave the last question for Dr. Lucey. Michael?
So first of all, thank you, Catherine. I loved your talk, but then again, I was going to love it. You know, you knew that from the start. My question is, can you tell us something about what is a source? Because I think that's a hard thing for us to understand. What is a source for you? When you get information, what is that?
Well, my sources tell me. A source, it really is just a person who's provided you with information. So sometimes that's the source is you know, a you know, official that is paid to interface with media, you know, a press secretary or a spokesperson. Sometimes your sources are people who want to provide information but don't want their names or their identities in stories, and you have to try and protect that. And so when you hear reporters talking about sources, it broadly is just the people who have given them the information that can make them, that informs the story.
And are you ever worried that there's about the motives of the person who's giving you the information?
Well, that's a key thing you analyze when you know, when you're determining whether to use the information. And you rarely go on just a single source. You're usually trying to make sure you have more than one person telling things. You want to check it against other sources, especially if you think there could be motives for the person. Now, the motives, you know, may or may not impact the accuracy of the information, but you're always trying to double check and triple check that the information is correct.
Good. Yeah. Lynn, that was my question.
Great. Well, thank you. And I really want to thank Catherine for agreeing to come to this forum. I think it's a little bit different from her usual setting. It's a bit different for us for Medical Grand Rounds, but I thought it was a great opportunity for us to take advantage of our connections. And it is a unique time in our history. So I think that, you know, the Trump administration, Biden, how we confront public health crises and how politics inform it is, you know, relevant to everything that we do. So thank you again, Catherine, for everything that you do in reporting and bringing the truth to us, or the stories to us.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope it was helpful if it did not provide any continuing medical education.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lynn.